On a January night in 1873, with the wind screaming across the Wisconsin prairie at 31 miles per hour and the temperature sitting at 36 degrees below zero, a man named Kermit Osgood stood inside a small cabin that should not have been warm, but it was warm. He put his hand flat against a stone wall in the corner of the kitchen and left it there for a long time. Then he turned to the woman standing by the stove and said in the voice of a man who has been wrong about something important, "I'm burning 70 pounds of wood a day and my house is colder than yours." The woman did not answer right away. She poured him another cup of coffee. 4 months earlier, Kermit Osgood had called her a fool. He had called what she built dangerous. He had asked her in the loud, slow voice some menus when they suspect a woman is in over her head, whether she had spoken to a man about her plans. But that part of the story comes later. The beginning is not the winter. The beginning is a June afternoon, a draft horse and a kick to the chest. Sylva Wainwright died on a Tuesday. It was the kind of prairie afternoon that should have belonged to a longer life, the sky wide and blue above the quarter section of Wisconsin land he and his wife Sylva had claimed 3 years earlier. They had come from the western coast of Jutland in Denmark, carrying 2 trunks, a small leather Bible, and a folded sheath of papers describing the homestead they meant to build a future on. Luther was a quiet man, the son of a fisherman, and the grandson of a fisherman, but he had decided long before they left Denmark that he wanted to plant his hands in soil rather than pull them dripping out of cold North Sea water. Sylva had agreed to follow him because she loved him and because she had her own reasons to want a country where no Prussian soldier had ever ridden through her grandmother's garden. The horse that killed him was their own. A big gray draft gelding that Luther had been harnessing for field work when something, a horsefly or a shadow or nothing at all, caused the animal to lash out with both hind legs. The kick caught Luther square in the chest. Sylva was in the cabin 60 yards away when she heard the sound, a sound she would later describe to no one because there were no words for it in English or Danish. And by the time she reached him, he was on the ground with his eyes open and his mouth trying to form her name. He died in her arms before she could ride for help. She was 43 years old. He was the only person in the world who had ever looked at her and seen not a fisherman's daughter with broad shoulders and rough hands, but someone whose mind he wanted to understand. After the funeral, the neighbors assumed Sylva would sell the claim and go back east, perhaps to Chicago, perhaps further. A few of them rode by with offers framed politely as concerned, the kind of offers that would give a grieving widow enough money to travel and not much more. Sylva listened to each one. She thanked them, and she stayed. She had buried Luther under a hawthorn tree at the edge of the claim, and she found she could not leave him there alone. The first visitor with a different kind of offer came 2 weeks after the funeral. His name was Wendell Colfax, and he was not a neighbor. He was a land dealer who operated out of the county seat, a man of about 55 with a clean vest and a leather satchel, and the particular polish of someone who had learned to profit from other people's grief without ever raising his voice. He sat at Sylva's kitchen table, accepted a cup of coffee, and laid out his proposal in terms he clearly considered generous. The number he named was roughly a third of what the claim was worth. "A woman alone can't hold land through a Wisconsin winter, Mrs. Wainwright," he said, stirring his coffee with a careful hand. "That's not sentiment, that's arithmetic." Sylva looked at him across the table. She looked at his clean vest and his leather satchel and his stirring spoon. Then she stood up and opened the cabin door. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Colfax. The road back to town is where you left it." Colfax did not seem offended. He picked up his satchel with the unhurried calm of a man who had done this many times before and would do it many times again. At the edge of the porch, he turned back. You'll change your mind before December, Mrs. Wainwright. They always do. She closed the door without answering, but she stood behind it for a long time after he left, and she noticed that her hands were shaking and she could not make them stop. The idea came to her not as inspiration, but as memory. It arrived in late August of 1872, more than a year after Luther's death, while she sat at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil and a sheet of brown paper trying to figure out how she was going to survive the coming winter alone. She had been thinking about heat, about firewood, about the 30 cords of oak and hickory she would need to cut and split and stack before November, and whether her back and her arms and her 43-year-old body could manage that much wood in that little time, and what would happen if it could not. She had been thinking about this for an hour, drawing numbers on the brown paper and crossing them out when the memory came. Her grandmother's smokehouse in Bramming, a squat structure of fieldstone and brick at the back of the farmyard with a heavy oak door and a low chimney and walls that held heat the way a Bible held promises. Sylva had spent dozens of childhood winters in and out of that smokehouse, helping her grandmother turn pork bellies on their hooks, feeding the slow fire of beechwood and juniper that gave the hams their color. She remembered the warmth of the smokehouse walls in January, how the stones stayed warm for half a day after the fire was banked, how the farm cats gathered in a tight knot against the south face of the building and refused to move until spring. She remembered her grandmother standing in the doorway of the smokehouse on a bitter morning, looking across the frozen yard at the farmhouse and saying in the dry tone of a woman who had spent 8 decades extracting the maximum benefit from every stick of wood she ever burned, "It is a foolish thing to let so much heat go to waste into the open air when a person has a perfectly cold house only a few steps away." That sentence had lived inside Sylva for 30 years without finding a use. And now, on a late August evening in Wisconsin, with the pencil stub in her hand and the brown paper covered in crossed-out numbers, it returned to her with a force that made her sit very still. Why should she build a smokehouse 50 paces from her cabin and walk back and forth through the snow to tend it? Why should one fire warm her kitchen and another fire smoke her meat when the same fire could do both? Why should the heat that entered the smokehouse walls escape into the empty air of a yard where no one lived, when that heat could instead pass through the wall into a room where a woman was trying not to freeze? She turned the brown paper over and began to draw. She was not an architect. She had never built anything more complicated than a chicken coop. But she had watched Luther frame their cabin 2 summers earlier, and she had watched her grandfather build a stone bread oven when she was 11, and she knew in the unconfused way that practical people often know things exactly what she wanted. A smokehouse chamber, 4 feet deep, 6 feet wide, and 8 feet tall, set against the south face of her cabin, so that the chamber's long inner wall would be shared with the cabin's kitchen wall. That shared wall would be built of fieldstone laid up with lime mortar 24 inches thick enough, massed to absorb heat all day and release it through the night. The outer wall of the smokehouse, the one that faced the prairie, would be lighter only 12 inches because she did not want it hoarding heat that should be traveling inward. The roof of the chamber would be a low arch of brick vented through a small iron flue that could be choked nearly closed during smoking and opened fuller during cold snaps. The whole thing would project from the south wall of her cabin like a stout little annex, and at the back of it, accessible from the yard, would be a heavy iron door through which she would load wood and hang her meat from inside the cabin. The only sign of the smokehouse would be a warm stone wall in the corner of her kitchen and a small cast iron damper handle she could adjust without going outside in the snow. She showed the drawing to Glenn Langford, the man who had the claim 2 miles east of hers, and who had taken on a kind of unofficial older brother role since Luther died. Glenn was a decent man, a good hunter, and he had quietly done more for Sylva than anyone else in the settlement, bringing her venison in November and checking her roof after storms. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he said with the careful gentleness men sometimes use with women they think have lost their grip on reality, that she should let him bring his cousin from Eau Claire to build her a proper detached smokehouse the following spring. Sylva thanked him for his concern. She refilled his coffee. She changed the subject. That evening, alone in the cabin, she took the drawing out again and laid it flat on the table. She thought about Luther, about the way he had taught her to use his transit level patiently, never once saying, "Let me do it for you," always saying, "Try again, you'll see." Luther was the rare kind of man who believed anyone could understand anything if given the chance. Sylva folded the drawing carefully and placed it inside the leather Bible where she kept the things she did not intend to give up. 2 days later, she rode into the settlement and bought 140 pounds of lime, 2 kegs of nails, 3 lengths of iron flue pipe, and the heavy oak and iron smokehouse door she had been planning since June. The storekeeper, a thin man named Arden Jessup, who had himself come over from Aalborg in 1864, asked her what she meant to do with all of it. Sylva told him plainly. Jessup looked at her for a moment, then said in Danish, so that no one else in the store would understand, "Your grandmother would have approved." It was the only encouraging thing anyone said to her in those first weeks. She was stepping off the porch of the general store when Ardith Jessup, the storekeeper's wife, came hurrying after her. Ardith was a tall, quiet woman in her early 50s who rarely inserted herself into conversations, and Sylva had never exchanged more than pleasantries with her. But Ardith's face now had an expression that Sylva recognized as the look of a woman who has been thinking about something for days and has finally decided to speak. "My husband believes you, Mrs. Wainwright," Ardith said in a low voice. "I could see his face when he spoke to you. I don't understand Danish, but I know that look." Sylva waited. Ardith hesitated, glancing back toward the store. "But you should know that Reverend Latham has heard about your plans. Yesterday he asked my husband what materials you were buying." She paused. He didn't seem pleased. Sylva rode home thinking about that. She had expected the neighbors to talk. She had not expected the talking to reach the pulpit. 3 days later, Reverend Alton Latham came to her cabin. He was a man of about 60, lean and straight-backed, with the weathered hands of someone who had worked hard before he found his calling, and the careful diction of someone who had been talking to God for so long that he expected a certain standard of conversation from everyone else. He was not a cruel man. Sylva had seen him sit up all night with a sick child, and she had seen him ride 10 miles in a blizzard to pray with a dying farmer. But he had a fixed idea about how a community should work, and that idea placed himself at the center of it, and he had buried 4 people since arriving in this parish, 2 from cold and 1 from a house fire. And each burial had deepened his conviction that the people in his care needed guidance more than they needed independence. He sat at Sylva's table and folded his hands and spoke. "Mrs. Wainwright, I have buried 4 people in this parish since I came here. 2 froze to death, 1 burned to death in her own cabin when the stovepipe failed. I do not want to bury a 5th. He paused, choosing his words with the precision of a man who wrote sermons. "If you build a fire inside the wall of your cabin, and that cabin catches fire on a January night, you will die. And I will have to stand over your grave and tell these people that God called you home, when the truth will be that stubbornness killed you." Sylva listened. She could feel the weight of his concern, and she did not dismiss it because she understood that it came from a real place. But she also understood that his concern was not quite about her safety. It was about his authority. He was the man who told this community what was wis and what was foolish, and she was building something he had not approved. Reverend, she said, the shared wall will be 2 feet of solid stone and lime mortar. Fire will not pass through 2 feet of stone any more than a prayer will pass through 2 feet of stone. That is physics. Latham looked at her for a long time. He was not accustomed to being answered with physics. I pray you are right, Mrs. Wainwright, he said, and then he left. The following Sunday, his sermon touched on the dangers of pride, on the temptation to believe oneself wiser than the community. He named no names. He did not need to. By Monday morning, every farm in a 5-mile radius had heard about the Danish widow who thought she knew better than the preacher and who was building a fire inside her own wall. Sylva did not let the talk slow her down. She began the foundation work in the second week of August. The cabin she and Luther had built was modest, 22 feet by 16, with a steep pitched roof and a single chimney at the north end. She planned to keep the original chimney and stove for her main heat source. The smokehouse would be supplementary. It would simply mean that every time she lit a fire to smoke her hams or sausages, she would also be heating a thick stone wall that would radiate warmth into her kitchen for hours after the smoking fire died. The fieldstones came from the long, low ridge that crossed the back of her quarter section. Luther had cleared most of them off the plowable acres during their first summer and had stacked them into a boundary wall along the property line. Sylva spent 2 weeks taking that wall apart, sorting the stones for size and shape, hauling them by stone boat down to the cabin site. The work left her hands cracked and her back aching every night, but there was a grim satisfaction in it that she did not try to name. Luther had cleared those stones from the field. Now she would use them to build something that would keep her alive through the winter he had not lived to see. Kermit Osgood was the first to come inspect. He was a Norwegian sheep farmer whose claim lay just to the north, a man of about 50, with a loud voice and a habit of inserting himself into everyone's business. He drew up his horse at the edge of her yard, took in the excavated foundation trenches, the stacks of sorted fieldstone, the carefully marked corner stakes, and asked her in a voice that carried across the yard what exactly she thought she was building. Sylva stood up from the trench. She wiped her hands on her apron. She told him. Kermit asked if she understood the fire risk. She answered. He asked if the smoke would soak into her cabin. She answered. He asked if she had spoken to a man about this. She answered that too. She had spoken to her grandfather 40 years ago in Jutland, and he had built 3 of them in his lifetime, and they had all worked. Kermit did not leave satisfied. Before turning his horse, he stopped and said something that stayed with Sylva longer than the rest. Mrs. Wainwright, if your cabin catches fire in the night, I'm the one who has to ride through the snow to put it out. You're thinking about yourself. Are you thinking about your neighbors? Sylva did not answer, not because she had no answer, but because the question was not entirely unreasonable. That night, she sat at her kitchen table and checked her drawings again. She measured the wall thickness one more time. 24 inches was correct. The math had not changed, but she was grateful for the question because it forced her to verify what she already knew, and verification was never wasted. The walls went up in September, the slowest and most satisfying work she had ever done. She mixed her lime mortar in a wooden trough, 2 parts sand to 1 part lime, with just enough water to make it stiff but workable. She laid each stone individually, fitting the shapes together the way her grandfather had taught her. Larger stones on the outer faces, smaller stones tucked between every joint, broken so that no vertical seam ran more than 2 courses without offsetting. 40 to 60 stones a day. Her shoulders ached the first week, then grew strong again, in a way they had not been since she was young. The shared wall was the one she took the most care with. She wanted no gaps, no seam where smoke could leak or where a stray ember could find its way through. She used her largest, flattest stones for the inner and outer faces and packed the center with smaller stones bedded heavily in mortar. When she finished, she pressed her ear against it and heard nothing. No wind, no bird song, no squirrels in the hawthorn. The wall swallowed sound. She knew it would swallow heat the same way and give it back slowly, and that was the whole idea. Then the rain came. 4 days of steady cold rain at the end of September, the kind of rain that turns a building site into a swamp. Sylva covered the unfinished walls with canvas, but water found its way through. On the morning of the 5th day, she went out to inspect and found that a section of the shared wall about 15 stones near the top, where the mortar had not fully cured, had shifted. Not collapsed, but tilted outward by roughly 2 inches. The rain had softened the fresh mortar enough that the weight of the stones above had pushed the uncured section out of plumb. She would have to take down 15 stones, scrape the old mortar, mix new mortar, and lay them again. 3 days of work at least. That night, Sylva sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood and thought about stopping. Not because she doubted the design. The design was sound. She knew this the way she understood salt and smoke and the weight of a cured ham. But she counted the weeks. Winter would arrive in 6 weeks, maybe 5. She had lost 3 days to rain. The brick arch had not been started. The flue pipe was still lying in pieces on the porch, and she had 2 hands. Only 2 hands. She sat there past midnight. The cabin was dark except for the low glow of the stove. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and the silence that followed was the kind of silence that can feel like an answer, or like the absence of one, depending on what you need to hear. Sylva opened the leather Bible and took out the drawing on brown paper. She spread it on the table and looked at her own pencil lines, straight and clear and certain. And she asked herself a question she had never asked before. If this were Luther's drawing, would she tell him to stop? She knew the answer before the question was finished. She would say, "Stack those 15 stones again, Luther. Rain is rain." She folded the drawing. She put it back. She went to bed. And in the morning, while the sky was still dark, she was in the yard with her trowel and her mortar trough, scraping the old mortar off 15 stones. 3 days later, the section was rebuilt plumb and true. She checked it with Luther's transit level, the instrument she had been afraid to touch for months after his death, because it reminded her of him bending over it on bright June mornings. She was not afraid of it anymore. She could hear his voice in her ear when she set the crosshairs. She thought he would have approved. By the 2nd week of October, with the prairie grasses gone golden brown and the geese moving in long ribbons across the sky toward Illinois, the Smokehouse chamber was finished. All that remained was the hardest piece, the brick arch. She built a wooden form, a low-curving template of pine boards, and she laid the bricks over it in a herringbone pattern that distributed the weight evenly to the side walls. She worked for 2 days on the arch, laying each brick with the slow deliberateness of someone who knows that this is the part where haste will cost everything. On the 3rd day, she knocked the wooden form free. The arch held. Sylva sat down in the dirt of the yard and cried for 10 minutes. Not because she was sad, because she was so tired and so proud and so sharply aware that Luther would have laughed and kissed her on the forehead and called her the most stubborn woman he had ever met and the only one he could possibly have married. She cried because he was not there to say it, and because the arch was standing on its own, and because both of those things were true at the same time and would be true for the rest of her life. When she looked up, wiping her face with the back of her hand, Ardith Jessup was standing at the edge of the yard. Ardith had walked 3 miles from the general store. She was holding a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside was a set of brass damper handles, better than anything Sylva could have fabricated herself. Art and Jessup had ordered them from Milwaukee for another customer, but Ardith had quietly set them aside and carried them here. "My husband will be cross," Ardith said, "but he'll forget about it in a week." Sylva held the damper handles in her hands. They were well-made, heavy, smooth. She said, "Why are you helping me, Mrs. Jessup?" Ardith said, "Because I also had a grandmother, Mrs. Wainwright." The two women looked at each other across the yard where the arch was still standing, and the October light was falling gold across the fieldstone walls. They did not need to say anything more. Sylva set the iron door into the outer wall on a Saturday afternoon while a cold wind out of the northwest threw the first thin flakes of snow against her face. Inside the chamber, she installed the smoking rack, two heavy oak crossbeams set into pockets in the stone from which she would hang her meat on iron hooks. Below the rack, she built a small fire brick hearth raised 6 inches off the chamber floor. The flue rose 6 feet to a brick stub of chimney, and inside the cabin, just to the right of her kitchen work table, the damper handle that Ardith had brought hung from its iron rod like a small, clean lever. Sylva turned it once, twice, 3 times, smooth and precise. She closed her eyes and she was embalming. The smell of beechwood smoke and salted pork. The chickens scratching outside the door. Her grandmother's voice dry and certain, telling her that every fire should earn its keep twice over. Sylva opened her eyes. She was in Wisconsin. She was alone. The snow was thickening outside the window, and the wind was beginning to find its winter voice, the low, steady moan that would not stop until April. She was ready. The neighbors thought she was a fool. By Christmas, she was going to find out which of them was right. 3 weeks passed between the last nail and the first fire. 3 weeks of gray November skies and falling temperatures, while Sylva Wainwright waited for the pork bellies in her root cellar to finish curing, and the settlement waited for her cabin to burn down. Neither happened on anyone's schedule. The first hard freeze came on the 11th of November, a clean cold that dropped the night temperature to 15 degrees above zero and laid a thin glaze of ice across the rain barrel by morning. Sylva was awake before dawn. She dressed in 2 wool shirts and her heavy felted overskirt and walked outside into a darkness that smelled of iron and dead grass, and she opened the iron door of the smokehouse chamber for the first time since she had finished building it 3 weeks earlier. The inside of the chamber was dry and cold. She ran her hand along the stone walls and felt nothing but the deep stillness of rock that has not yet been asked to do its work. The oak crossbeams overhead were pale in the lantern light. The iron hooks hung empty. The fire brick hearth at the bottom was clean. She had been curing pork bellies in salt and brown sugar for 2 weeks in a wooden tub in her root cellar, and the bellies were ready. Firm and dry to the touch, darkened from the sugar, the salt drawn deep into the flesh. 4 of them each about 10 pounds, the entire yield of a single hog she had bought from Kermit Osgood in September. Kermit had finally stopped scolding her about the smokehouse by then and had decided with the practicality of a man who needed cash before winter that her money spent as well as anyone else's. She hung the bellies on their hooks. She swept the fire pan clean and built a small, careful fire of dry beech splits with a few pieces of green apple wood on top for the color and the flavor. The trick to cold smoking pork, her grandmother had always said, was patience in a low fire. The temperature inside the chamber should never rise above 110 degrees, or the fat would begin to render and the meat would toughen. The smoke should be thin and steady like a long, thoughtful conversation, not the angry billow of a fast, hot fire. Sylva adjusted the damper to a half-closed position, banked the front of her fire with a small wall of ash, and shut the iron door. Then she went inside and put a kettle on for coffee. The shared wall was cold when she placed her hand on it that morning. Cold, but not frozen. She had banked the cabin stove the night before with a single split of oak, and the kitchen was holding around 40 degrees, which was about what she expected from the cabin in mid-November before the winter fires began in earnest. She drank her coffee at the table by the stove and watched the gray light come up over the prairie and waited. By mid-morning, the cold had gone out of the stones. She could feel the difference before she could have explained it to anyone. The chill that had been radiating off the shared wall for weeks, the kind of cold you feel against your shins when you stand near a north-facing wall in November, had simply disappeared. By noon, when she went outside to add another small split of beach to the smokehouse fire, the wall was warm to the touch. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 6 hours after she had lit the fire, the wall was warm enough that she could lean her back against it while sitting at the kitchen table peeling potatoes for supper, and the warmth came through 2 layers of wool and the back of the chair and into her spine, and she sat there for a long time and did not move. She had not expected it to work so quickly. Her grandmother's smokehouse in Denmark had been a freestanding structure radiating heat outward in every direction into the open air, into the yard, into nothing useful. But this wall had only two faces that mattered. The one inside the smokehouse chamber where the fire was, and the one inside her kitchen where she lived. The outer walls of the smokehouse, the brick arch, the floor, all of those were either insulated by the earth or heating the sealed air of the chamber itself, which recirculated its own warmth. Whatever heat the stone absorbed from the smoking fire had nowhere to go except into her kitchen, because every other direction was a dead end. She understood this now not as theory, but as fact, the way a baker understands dough or a fisherman understands tide. That evening, around 4 o'clock, there was a knock at the cabin door. It was not a neighbor, it was Wendell Colfax. He stood on her porch in a heavy wool coat, his breath making small clouds in the cold air, and he did not have the look of a man who had come to make another offer on her land. He had the look of a man who had come to deliver information. "Mrs. Wainwright," he said, "I thought you should know that I had a conversation with the land office in the county seat last week. Some people have raised questions about whether you're making unauthorized improvements to a homestead claim, structures that don't meet standard building practices." Sylva stood in the doorway. She did not invite him in. "Who raised those questions, Mr. Colfax?" "I couldn't say. These things move through official channels." He smiled the thin smile of a man who knows exactly how official channels work because he is the one feeding them. "I'm only telling you as a courtesy. A woman in your position might want to be careful about attracting the wrong kind of attention." Sylva looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him across the yard to the hawthorn tree where the snow was beginning to settle on the mound of earth that was Luther's grave. "Mr. Colfax, this land is in my name and my husband's. My husband is buried under that tree. If you want this land, you'll have to dig him up first." Colfax said nothing more. He touched the brim of his hat and walked back to his wagon and drove away into the early dusk. Sylva closed the door. She stood behind it with her hands pressed flat against the wood, and this time they were not shaking. They were very still. But she did not sleep that night, not because of the cold. The cabin was warmer than it had been on any November night. She could remember the shared wall, still radiating a gentle heat into the kitchen long after the smokehouse fire had burned down to embers. She did not sleep because she knew that Colfax was not bluffing about the land office. The frontier was a place where laws were thin and connections were thick, and a man like Colfax could bend enough paperwork to cause trouble for a woman who had no lawyer and no allies with influence. Around 3 in the morning, she got up and took Luther's old household ledger from the shelf. It was the book he had used to track their grain sales, each entry in his neat, patient hand. Sylva turned to the back of the ledger to the blank pages, and she began to write. Outside temperature at dawn. Outside temperature at noon. Outside temperature at dusk. Cabin temperature in 3 places near the main stove in the middle of the room and against the shared wall. She did not yet have a thermometer, but 3 winters on the prairie had given her a feel for temperature that she trusted, and she would later check her woes against the territorial weather records and find them accurate within 2 or 3 degrees. She was building a record. Numbers, evidence. If Colfax or anyone else challenged her, she would have something more persuasive than words. Her grandmother had taught her that much numbers did not bend under pressure the way arguments did. By the 3rd week of November, the smokehouse had settled into a steady rhythm. Sylva smoked 1 batch of pork bellies for 3 days, then took them down and replaced them with 2 whole hams she had also salted and cured. After the hams, she hung 8 feet of link sausages strung on hazelwood rods she had cut and peeled herself. After the sausages, she planned mutton, having bought half a sheep from Kermit at a discount because he had twisted his ankle and could not finish his own butchering. The smokehouse fire ran at low temperature for 10 to 14 hours a day, with a small bank of embers left to smolder through the night so that the chamber would not cool entirely. She burned between 15 and 20 pounds of wood per day in the smokehouse, and every one of those small, slow fires was simultaneously heating her cabin. By the end of November, with outside temperatures regularly dropping into the single digits at night, Sylva had not yet started what she would have called serious winter fires in her main cabin stove. She kept a small cooking fire mornings and evenings, mostly for hot food and coffee. The bulk of her warmth was coming through the wall. Kermit Osgood came by on the 1st of December. He said he had come to ask whether she needed help slaughtering chickens. Sylva suspected the real reason was to see whether the strange Danish woman was still alive in her dangerous cabin. He stamped the snow off his boots on her porch, ducked through the door, and stopped 2 steps inside. He stood very still. He looked around the kitchen with the slow, careful attention of a man who is seeing something he cannot immediately explain. Sylva watched his face. She had learned over 43 years that the most powerful arguments were the ones you did not need to make out loud. She invited him to sit. She poured him coffee. He took the cup in both hands and did not drink it. He kept looking around the room. After a while, he noticed the shared wall. He noticed the chair that had been pulled slightly away from the table, angled toward the stones, as if someone had been sitting there with their back to the warmth. He stood up, walked to the wall, and laid his hand flat against it. He left it there for a long time. When he turned around, his face had changed. Something had gone out of it, some certainty he had carried in with him, and something else had taken its place. "How much wood are y'all burning a day?" he asked. 20 in the smokehouse, maybe 10 in the cabin stove. 30 total on the coldest days of late November. Kermit sat down. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and stared at the table. "I'm burning 60, he said. 70 on the bad nights, and my house is colder than yours." He was quiet for a while. Then he said something Sylva had not expected. "Cora has been coughing every night." Cora was his youngest, 4 years old. Irma sits up with her by the stove until the child falls asleep. Then Irma goes to bed. But by 3 in the morning, the cabin is so cold that Irma has to get up and feed the stove again, and by then Cora is coughing again. He paused. "I've used nearly half my winter wood already, and it's the 1st of December." Sylva looked at this man who had ridden up to her yard in August and asked her in a carrying voice whether she had spoken to a man about her plans. She looked at the lines around his eyes and the way his shoulders sat heavy with something that was not just cold, but the particular exhaustion of a father who cannot keep his child warm. "If it comes to that, Mr. Osgood," she said, "bring your family here." Kermit looked at her. He nodded once slowly and finished his coffee and rode away into the early dark. Neither of them said anything more about it. Both of them hoped it would not be necessary. By the end of that week, two more neighbors had stopped by, both with thin pretexts, and both had left with the same troubled, thoughtful expression Kermit had worn. The talk in the settlement had begun to turn. The killing cold came in the third week of January. Sylva had been smoking venison that week, 3 deer carcasses that Glenn Langford had shot for her in exchange for 2 cured hams and a sack of seed oats. The strips hung from the upper rack inside the chamber, and the fire underneath was small and very slow, mostly hickory with a little maple, because she wanted the meat tough and dry, almost like jerky, the way it needed to be if it was going to keep for 2 years in a tight crock. The fire had been running steadily for 4 days when the wind shifted on the afternoon of January 18th. A great low-gray cloud came swelling up out of the northwest with a particular dull silence that the Prairie people had learned to recognize. It was the silence that came before the worst storms, the silence of the atmosphere gathering itself. By evening, the temperature had dropped to 12 below zero. By dawn the next morning, it was 28 below. By the second night, with a steady north wind that the territorial weather station at La Crosse would record at 31 miles per hour, the temperature reached 36 below zero. The wind chill, though no one used that term yet, was effectively 65 below. It was the kind of cold that froze a horse's nostrils shut between the barn and the house. The kind that killed cattle standing up in their stalls if a barn door blew open. The kind that could overwhelm even a roaring stove and turn the inside of a cabin into a slower, smaller version of the death that waited outside. Sylva's cabin held. The shared wall was running at roughly 140 degrees on the smokehouse side and about 78 on the kitchen side. The kitchen itself held at 56 degrees with the main stove burning at half its normal winter rate. Sylva wore one wool shirt, no gloves, no shawl. A mile and a half to the west, the Osgood family was not doing as well. Their cabin was larger than Sylva's, with a second loft floor for the 3 children, built in the standard Wisconsin pattern of squared logs with mortar chinking. In ordinary cold, it worked well enough. In 36 below, with a 30-mile wind, it was failing. The wind drove cold air through every gap. The loft where the children slept dropped below 20 degrees by the second night. Kermit moved all 3 children downstairs and stayed up feeding the stove at a rate of nearly 100 pounds of wood every 24 hours, and the cabin was still losing. The same situation was playing out across the settlement. Merle Trumbull, a bachelor of 26 with a small cabin a mile north, ran out of cut firewood on the second night and broke up his own porch railing to burn. Glenn Langford was burning 60 to 80 pounds a day, and his daughter Benita had developed a cough that worsened with every passing hour. His wife Leona sat up through the night in the chair by the stove, holding the child against her chest. Norval Putnam, the blacksmith at the crossroads, lost a horse to the cold when a crack in his barn door, one he had meant to repair since October, widened in the wind enough to let the killing air inside. Norval had built what most people considered the best small cabin in the area, and even he was struggling. On the second night of the cold snap, Sylva sat alone in her warm cabin and listened to the wind. Through the kitchen window, she could see the faint glow of the Osgood cabin's chimney to the west, and something about that glow troubled her. It was too thin, too pale. A chimney producing healthy smoke from a well-fed fire throws a column of white or gray that holds its shape even in wind. The smoke she could see from Kermit's chimney was barely a wisp tearing apart as soon as it left the flue. It meant the fire was weak. Either Kermit was running out of wood, or the stove could not keep up with the cold, or both. Sylva put on her boots. She wrapped a wool scarf twice around her face and pulled her heaviest coat over her shoulders and stepped outside into 30 below zero. She did not walk toward Kermit's cabin. She knew Kermit well enough by now to understand that if she showed up at his door offering help, he would refuse it, not out of malice, but out of the same rigid pride that had made him ride up to her yard in August and ask whether she had consulted a man. Kermit would not accept rescue from the woman he had publicly doubted. Not yet. Not until his pride had been ground down further than it had been ground so far. Instead, she walked to Glenn Langford's cabin, 200 yards to the east. The wind hit her face like a wall of broken glass. The snow on the ground was so cold it squeaked under her boots with a sound like tearing cloth. She kept her head down and counted her steps and tried not to think about what would happen if she fell and could not get up. Leona Langford opened the door before Sylva could knock. Leona's face was gray. Behind her, in the dim light of a stove that was clearly losing its battle with the cold bonita, was curled in a nest of blankets, coughing in the shallow, persistent way that children cough when their lungs have been cold for too long. "Bring the child to my cabin," Sylva said. "Right now." Leona looked back at Glenn, who was standing by the stove with an armful of wood. Glenn looked at Sylva. He looked at his daughter. He nodded without speaking. They wrapped Bonita in every blanket they could carry and walked back through the killing wind to Sylva's cabin. Inside, they placed the child on the chair closest to the shared wall, the chair where Sylva sat every afternoon with the warmth of the stones against her back. Within 30 minutes, the coughing began to ease. Within an hour, Bonita was asleep. Not the restless, shivering sleep of a child fighting cold, but the deep, still sleep of a body that has finally found warmth and surrendered to it. Leona sat at the table and wept without making a sound. Sylva put the kettle on. She did not say "I told you so" because it was not a thing she would ever say, and because it was not a thing that needed saying. The wall was saying it. The sleeping child was saying it. The quiet cabin in the middle of a night that was trying to kill everyone for miles in every direction was saying it louder than any words she had ever spoken or ever would. On the morning of the fourth day, with the temperature at 22 below and the wind finally beginning to slacken, Kermit Osgood knocked at Sylva's door. He was wearing two coats, a wool scarf wrapped twice around his face, the red hollow eyes of a man who has not properly slept in 3 nights. Behind him, hitched to his lead horse, was a sled, and on the sled, wrapped in every quilt the Osgood household possessed, sat Irma and the 3 children. Sylva opened the door without asking any questions. She had been expecting them, or someone like them, since the second night. "Sylva," Kermit said. His voice broke on the second syllable. He could not seem to manage more than her name. "Come in," she said. "All of you, bring the children." Kermit carried Cora inside. The child was limp and pale and very quiet, the kind of quiet that is worse than crying. Irma came behind, holding the 2 older children by their hands, and when she stepped through the doorway into the warm cabin, she stopped. She stood on the threshold and looked around the room. She looked at the warmth. She looked at Bonita Langford, sleeping peacefully by the wall, no longer coughing. She looked at the pot of bean soup with smoked ham that Sylva had started that morning, having watched the smoke from the Osgood chimney and made an educated guess. And then Irma looked at her husband. "I told you on the first night," she said. Her voice was not angry. It was something worse than angry. It was precise. Kermit did not look at his wife. He sat down at the table and wrapped his hands around the cup of coffee Sylva placed in front of him and stared at the floor. Sylva understood in that moment what had happened. Irma had wanted to come on the first night when the cold was already dangerous, but the pride had not yet been tested. Kermit had refused. He had kept his family in that cabin for 2 additional nights, his children shivering in a bed he could not keep warm, rather than ride to the door of the woman he had called foolish and ask for help. Sylva said nothing about it. She settled the children. She heated soup. Cora climbed into Sylva's lap without being asked and fell asleep within 10 minutes, the kind of bone-deep sleep that small children fall into when they have finally stopped fighting cold. Irma sat at the table and cried quietly for nearly half an hour, and Sylva let her cry because some things needed to come out before other things could begin. By that evening, 3 more families had arrived. Glenn and Leona Langford had already been there since the second night. Merle Trumbull came alone, having run out of both firewood and the will to keep pretending he could manage. The Osborne family, from the claim south of the creek, brought themselves and their grandmother, an 80-year-old woman who had been on the edge of frostbite when they finally made the decision to leave. By nightfall, Sylva's 22 by 16-foot cabin held 14 people. The body heat alone of 14 human beings was enough to push the temperature higher. Combined with the steady radiation from the shared wall, the cabin became, for 2 days and 3 nights, the warmest building within 5 miles in any direction, and it accomplished this on less than 50 pounds of wood a day. Kermit alone had been burning more than that in his own cabin and failing. Around midnight, with the children asleep and the adults sitting in the kind of silence that follows a shared ordeal, Kermit Osgood stood up. He walked across the cabin to the corner where Sylva was sitting sewing a torn blanket for the Osborne grandmother. He stood in front of her and he spoke loudly enough for every person in the room to hear. "Mrs. Wainwright, I owe you an apology." Sylva looked up from her sewing. "I said you were building wrong. I said you'd burn your cabin down. I said you needed a man to set you straight. I was wrong. I was wrong about all of it." The cabin was silent except for the wind outside and the slow breathing of sleeping children. Irma, sitting across the room with Cora in her arms, looked at her husband with an expression that Sylva recognized as relief. Not the relief of vindication, but the deeper relief of a woman who has been waiting for the man she married to become, even briefly, the man she believed he could be. Sylva said, "You weren't wrong to worry, Mr. Osgood. You were wrong to judge instead of ask." She cut the thread, folded the blanket, and carried it to the Osborne grandmother. The cold snap broke on January 24th. By the morning of the 25th, the temperature had climbed to 6 above, and the wind had laid down, and the refugees in Sylva's cabin began to talk about going home. They did not leave easily. They were grateful, but more than grateful, they were curious. They wanted to understand. Sylva showed them. She walked them outside to see the iron door and the squat chamber projecting from her south wall. She walked them back inside and showed them the damper handle and the warm stone wall that ran the full length of her kitchen. She showed them her household ledger with its careful temperature records from November and December. And she explained in calm, clear sentences she had been silently rehearsing for 2 months the principle behind what she had built. The fire that smoked her meat was the same fire that heated her wall. The wall stored the heat and released it slowly. The fire was small and efficient because it was throttled for smoking, not for fast heating. The chamber was insulated by being half buried against the cabin's own structure, so it lost almost nothing to the outside air. The fuel that would have been spent running a separate smokehouse was, by this design, also serving as the cabin's primary heat source. She was not burning extra wood. She was using the same wood twice. They listen the way people listen when they have been cold enough to and have found warmth enough to live and want to understand the difference. Sylva was nearly finished when she became aware that someone else had entered the cabin. She had not heard the door. She turned and saw Reverend Alton Latham standing just inside the threshold. Snow on his shoulders, his face reddened by the cold. He had walked 2 miles. The cabin went quiet. Every face turned toward him. Everyone in the room remembered his autumn sermons about pride. Everyone remembered who he had been talking about. Latham looked around the room. He took in the scene: 14 people alive and warm children sleeping soundly, the air smelling of coffee and smoked meat. No sign of the disaster he had predicted. He looked at the shared wall. He looked at Sylva. "Mrs. Wainwright," he said, "in the autumn I came to this cabin and spoke to you about pride." He paused. His voice was rough, not with cold, but with something else. "I was wrong about who was proud." No one spoke. "Last night I sat alone in the church. The church was cold. I thought about the 4 people I have buried, and I thought that perhaps if I had spent less time preaching and more time listening to people who know how to build, I might not have needed to bury anyone." He did not shake her hand. He did not stay for coffee. He turned and walked back out into the bright, cold morning. But the following Sunday, his sermon told the story with no names, but every detail of a woman who had built a wall that kept an entire community alive on the coldest night in memory, and of the humility required to recognize wisdom in unexpected places. Sylva stood at her kitchen window that Sunday morning and watched the thin column of smoke from the church chimney rising straight into the still winter air. She did not attend the service. She had hams to turn. But she allowed herself for just a moment to think that the old woman in Bramming, the one who had taught her the weight of a cured ham and the value of a well-tended fire, would have looked at this Wisconsin kitchen with its warm stone wall and nodded once slowly the way she nodded when the sausages came out right. The winter was not over. The cold would return in February, and March would bring its own miseries. But something had shifted in the settlement that could not shift back. And out beyond the settlement, in a county office where a man named Wendell Colfax had been making inquiries, something else was waiting. Sylva knew it. She had known it since November when Colfax stood on her porch and smiled his thin smile and told her that some people had raised questions. The questions were coming. Spring was coming, and Sylva Wainwright, who had spent the winter building a record of numbers in the back of her husband's ledger, was ready for both. Spring came late to Wisconsin in 1873, as it often did. The snow held through the first week of April, then retreated in slow, grudging stages, uncovering the brown mat of last year's prairie grass and the black mud underneath. The creeks ran high with meltwater. The geese came back from Illinois in long, noisy formations, and the wind, which had spent 5 months trying to kill everything it touched, softened into something that merely made your eyes water. Sylva Wainwright began the season of teaching on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of April, when the ground had thawed just enough to take a shovel. She rode her horse 2 miles east to Glenn Langford's claim, carrying her sheath of brown paper drawings and a folding rule and a 2-pound hammer, and she stood in Glenn's yard and showed him where to dig. Glenn was the first because he had earned it. He had been the first to believe her, even if he had not said so publicly. He had brought her venison when no one else would ride that far. He had carried his daughter through the killing wind to Sylva's cabin on the 2nd night of the cold snap without being asked twice. And Benita's cough had not returned since that night, a fact that Leona Langford mentioned every time Sylva came by, not as gratitude exactly, but as evidence, the kind of evidence that a mother keeps close. Within a week, Kermit Osgood rode over and asked the questions Sylva had been expecting since January. How long would it take to build one onto my cabin? Start in May, work through the summer. You could have it ready by October. Will you help me? Yes. By the end of that day, 3 other men had asked the same question, and Sylva had said yes to each of them. She did not charge money. She told them they could pay in lime and dressed stone, in labor and cured pork, in whatever they could spare. She had grown up in a country where the women of the village understood that the only currency that truly held its value was the trust of one's neighbors, and trust was not something you charged interest on. She rode from claim to claim through May and June with her drawings and her folding rule. She advised on stone selection and showed them how to test lime for quality by dropping a handful into water and watching how fast it heated. She showed them how to build the wooden form for the brick arch and how to set the iron door so that it would not warp. She showed them how to size the flue so that the fire would draw at the low, steady rate that smoking required without smothering itself. She insisted with every family she taught on a wall thickness of at least 20 inches. She would not budge on that number. 20 inches was the line below which she would not put her name, and by now her name meant something. Merle Trumbull came to her early before the other families and asked to be taught alongside Glenn Langford. Merle was 26 strong, eager, and alone on a small claim a mile north. He had spent the worst night of the January cold, snap, burning the railing of his own porch to stay alive, and the experience had left a mark on him that went deeper than the frostbite scars on his left hand. He did not want to be that desperate again. Sylva looked at him and recognized the fear in his eyes, because it was a fear she knew. The fear of facing winter without enough. "You'll dig your foundation while I'm supervising Mr. Langford's walls," she told him. "Then I'll come check your work and we'll go from there." Merle nodded. From that day forward, he became her most reliable helper, hauling stone between the work sites, mixing mortar, running supplies. He worked with a quiet, dogged energy that reminded Sylva of the young men in Jutland who went out on the fishing boats for the first time and came back different, not because the sea had been kind to them, but because it had not. It was Merle who first told her about Norval Putnam. Norval was the blacksmith at the crossroads, a man of about 45 with thick forearms and a reputation for building things that did not break. His cabin was widely considered the best small structure in the settlement, tight-jointed and well-chinked, with a forge shed attached to the north side. He had lost a bay mare in the January cold snap, and the grief of it still showed in how he carried himself through the rest of the winter, slightly hunched as if bracing for the next blow. Norval decided to build a smokehouse wall, but Norval did not come to Sylva. He was a craftsman, the best in 3 townships. He did not need a farm widow to teach him how to lay stone any more than he needed someone to teach him how to swing a hammer. He designed his own version, a shared wall, 28 inches thick, faced with brick on the kitchen side, for additional thermal mass with a separate auxiliary compartment that could be sealed off during pure heating fires when no meat was being smoked. He added a clean-out door at the bottom and built a cast-iron damper assembly that he forged himself in his shop. It was in its details a more sophisticated piece of engineering than anything Sylva had drawn on her brown paper. But Norval made one mistake. He built his flue too wide and too tall. He built it the way a blacksmith builds a forged chimney designed to pull hard and feed oxygen to a hot fire. A forge needs fast air. A smokehouse needs the opposite. Norval's wide flue drew the fire too quickly, pulling heat up and out of the chimney before the stone walls could absorb it. His wife Inez noticed the problem before Norval did. She had been watching Sylva's wall all winter through the eyes of a woman who managed the household fires, and she knew what a working wall felt like. Norval's wall did not feel right. The stones stayed cool even after a full day of fire. Inez walked 3 miles to Sylva's cabin on a July afternoon and said, "Mrs. Wainwright, I think my husband has done something wrong with the chimney, and I think he knows it, and I think he will not come to you because he believes it would be an admission that a woman who has never held a forge hammer knows something he does not." Sylva saddled her horse and rode to the Putnam homestead. She walked around the smokehouse chamber, once slowly looking at the masonry, the ironwork, the damper. She spent a long time looking at the flue. Then she went inside the cabin and stood by the shared wall and placed the back of her hand near the stones without touching them. Cool. Not cold, but not what they should have been after 8 hours of fire. Norval stood in the doorway of his forge watching her. His arms were crossed. His jaw was set. He was a man waiting to be told he was wrong by someone he was not sure he could accept it from. Sylva understood this. She understood it the way she understood stone and mortar, and the behavior of heat, which is to say she understood it practically without theory, through long observation of how things actually worked rather than how they should have worked. And she knew that if she said the wrong thing, Norval would dig in and his wall would never work properly, and Inez and the children would spend another winter burning twice the wood they needed. "Mr. Putnam," she said, "the damper assembly you forged is the finest piece of ironwork I have seen in this country. Better than anything I could make or buy. But the best damper in the world cannot control a flue that pulls faster than the damper can hold it back. You have built a chimney that wants to run. What you need is a chimney that wants to walk." Norval uncrossed his arms. He looked at the flue, he looked at Sylva, and then he said something that surprised her. "What size?" They narrowed the flue together that afternoon. Norval did the ironwork. Sylva measured. When they finished, Norval lit a test fire in the chamber, and they stood in the kitchen and waited. 4 hours later, the wall was warm. Inez put her hand on the stones and closed her eyes and said, "There it is." Norval Putnam never said directly that Sylva had been right. That was not his way. But from that day forward, whenever anyone in the settlement asked him about Smokehouse walls, he said, "Go talk to Mrs. Wainwright. She knows more about it than anybody, including me." For Norval, that was the highest praise he had ever given to anyone who did not work in iron. The trouble with Merle Trumbull's wall came in December of that year during the second winter. Merle had run out of suitable stone in late September with his wall at 16 inches instead of the 20 that Sylva had specified. He had looked at the wall and calculated the remaining work and decided with the impatience of a young man who could see winter coming and did not want to spend another week hauling rock that 16 inches was close enough. He did not tell Sylva. He finished the wall, capped it, installed the flue, and lit his first fire in October, feeling proud of what he had accomplished. It worked well enough through the mild cold of November. Then on a night in mid-December, when the temperature swung from 20 above to 15 below in the span of 6 hours, the rapid thermal change cracked the mortar along a vertical seam in the thinnest section of the wall. Smoke began to seep through the crack into the cabin. Merle woke coughing, disoriented in the dark, and for a few bad seconds he could not remember where the door was. He found it by feel, threw it open, and stumbled out into the snow in his long underwear. Then he went around to the smokehouse door and smothered the fire with a shovel full of dirt. No one was hurt. The cabin did not catch fire. But the word traveled through the settlement the way bad news always travels faster than good. And by the next morning, there were people saying what Sylva had always known. Some people would say, if anything went wrong, that the whole idea was dangerous, that building fire into a wall was asking for trouble, that the Danish widow's invention was going to kill someone sooner or later. Sylva rode to Merle's cabin the next morning. She examined the crack. She ran her finger along the failed mortar joint and felt the thinness of the wall behind it. She already knew what she would find. "How thick did you build it?" she asked. Merle could not look at her. 16 inches. "I said 20. "I know." Sylva did not raise her voice. She did not lecture. She had spent too many years watching her grandmother handle the young men of the village who cut corners with the salting or rushed the smoking time to waste energy on anger when instruction would serve better. "Take it down," she said. "Build it again. I'll help." They spent 2 weeks in the middle of winter dismantling the failed section and rebuilding it. Sylva hauled stone from the ridge on a sled, the same ridge where Luther had cleared the rocks that became her own wall, and she stood beside Merle in the cold and watched him lay each stone and checked each course with her folding rule. The work was miserable. Their fingers went numb. The mortar had to be mixed with warm water to keep it from freezing before it set. But when they finished, the wall was 20 inches thick and solid, and it did not crack again that winter or any winter after. The story of Merle's wall became the story Sylva told everyone she taught from that point on. She did not tell it as a warning. She told it as a fact. A young man saved 4 inches of stone and nearly lost his cabin. It was the kind of sentence her grandmother would have approved of: short, specific, impossible to argue with. In the spring of 1874, Wendell Colfax made his final move. He did not come to Sylva. He went to the county land office and filed a formal complaint alleging that Sylva Wainwright had constructed a dangerous and unauthorized structure on her homestead, and that the structure had already caused one near fire, citing the incident at Merle Trumbull's cabin as evidence. He requested an inspection of the property, and if the structure was found to be unsafe, a review of her homestead claim. Glenn Langford heard about the complaint from a man at the general store and rode straight to Sylva's cabin to tell her. Sylva listened. She sat at her kitchen table in the chair by the shared wall, and she listened to every word Glenn said, and when he was finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she went to the shelf and took down Luther's ledger. She opened it to the back pages where she had been recording temperatures for 2 winters. 2 winters of daily entries 3 times a day in her careful hand. Outside temperature and cabin temperature, and the correlation between them week after week, month after month. She had started the record on a sleepless night in November when Colfax had first come to her porch with his talk of official channels, and she had kept it faithfully ever since. She took the ledger. She took her sheath of brown paper drawings with their precise dimensions, and she took one more thing, a letter that Norval Putnam had written. Nobody had asked Norval to write it. He had written it on his own after the incident at Merle's cabin because he had seen that a failure caused by one man's impatience could be used to condemn a system that worked. Norval wrote as a blacksmith and as the man who had built the most elaborate version of Sylva's design in the settlement, and he stated plainly that the Smokehouse wall system was safe when built to the specified thickness, and that the incident at the Trumbull cabin was the result of substandard construction, not faulty design. He signed it with his full name and the word blacksmith underneath because on the frontier, a skilled tradesman's word carried weight that a widow's word did not, and Norval understood this, and he was angry enough about it to do something useful with his anger. Sylva rode to the county seat alone on a Tuesday morning. The land office was a small frame building on the main street of a town that was not much more than a main street. The man behind the desk was named Olin, a tired-looking bureaucrat of middle age who had the particular expression of a man who has spent too many years arbitrating disputes between people who all believe they are right. Sylva placed 3 items on his desk: the ledger, the drawings, the letter from Norval Putnam. Then she sat down in the chair across from him and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Olin read the ledger first. He turned the pages slowly, and Sylva could see him registering the consistency of the entries, the methodical recording of temperatures, the absence of gaps or embellishments. He read the drawings. He read the letter from Norval Putnam. He set everything down and looked at Sylva. Mrs. Wainwright, Mr. Colfax says the Trumbull cabin nearly caught fire. Mr. Trumbull built his wall 4 inches thinner than the specification I gave him. His cabin did not nearly catch fire. Smoke entered through a mortar crack caused by insufficient wall thickness. He extinguished the smokehouse fire and suffered no damage. He and I have since rebuilt the wall to proper thickness. It has functioned without incident through the remainder of the winter. Olin looked at the papers on his desk again. Then he looked at Sylva. Mrs. Wainwright, Mr. Colfax's complaint has no technical basis. I will keep it on file, but there will be no further action. Sylva nodded. She gathered her papers. She rode home. Wendell Colfax left the settlement before summer. He moved his land dealing operation to another county where there were other widows and other failing homesteads and other people whose grief could be converted into acreage at a discount. He did not return. He did not need to. There was nothing left for him here. The woman he had expected to break had built something that would not break, and she had documented it with the thoroughness of a woman who had been raised to believe that evidence mattered more than influence, and she had defended it with the calm of a woman who had nothing left to lose except the things she had built with her own hands and those she was not willing to lose. By autumn of 1873, 6 smokehouse walls stood in the settlement. Kermit Osgood's was solid and workmanlike, built exactly to Sylva's specifications, with no deviation and no improvisation, because Kermit had learned something about the cost of thinking you knew better. Glenn Langford's was modest and efficient, sized for a small family, and Benita slept beside it on the coldest nights without coughing. Norval Putnam's, with his narrowed flue and its forged damper, was the most elaborate, and Inez would still be telling visitors about it 20 years later when the grandchildren came. The winter of 1873 to 1874 was another cold one. Not as savage as the January before, but with sustained periods of below-zero weather and heavy snow. The 6 new walls performed almost exactly as Sylva had predicted. Families reported using 40 to 55% less firewood than the previous year. Cabin temperatures held steadier through the night. And the meat that came out of the integrated chambers was better than what anyone had been getting from their old freestanding smokehouses, because the built-in chambers maintained more stable temperatures and needed less tending during long smoking runs. By the autumn of 1875, the design had traveled well beyond the original settlement. Glenn Langford's brother near Stevens Point built one. A man named Brogan near Eau Claire built one for his own house and one for his married son's cabin half a mile away. A correspondent from a Milwaukee agricultural newspaper visited Sylva's claim in October of 1875 and spent 2 days taking detailed notes. The article ran in the November issue under the title, "An Economical Heating Method Among the Danish Settlers." It gave Sylva her name in print for the first and only time in her life. The article produced in the months that followed a small but steady stream of letters from farmers as far away as Iowa and Minnesota. Sylva answered every one. Her English was not perfect, but her diagrams were clear, and she included with each reply a careful list of materials and dimensions and a brief note about the importance of wall thickness. She had concluded over 3 winters of observation that 24 inches was the right thickness for Wisconsin. In colder regions further north, she recommended up to 30. In milder areas, perhaps as little as 18. The number was not fixed. It had to match the climate in the smoking schedule of each household. But the principle was fixed, and the principle was simple: do not waste heat and do not skimp on stone. Among the letters she received was one from a woman named Hazel in Minnesota. Hazel was 38 years old with 2 small children and a husband who had died of typhoid the previous spring. She was facing her first winter alone, and she had read Sylva's article in the Milwaukee paper and written to ask for help. "I read what you built," Hazel wrote, "and I cried. Not from sadness, because for the first time someone showed me that being alone does not mean being unable." Sylva wrote back the longest letter of her life, 3 pages in her careful slanted hand with detailed diagrams drawn in the margins and measurements noted twice for clarity. She ended the letter with 5 words: build slowly, stone does not hurry. She never met Hazel, but 2 years later a second letter arrived. Hazel had built her wall. She had survived 2 winters. She had taught her neighbor. Sylva read the letter standing on her porch, looking out across the yard to the hawthorn tree where Luther lay, and she nodded once as if telling him. Sylva Wainwright remained on her claim until 1894. She was 65 years old when she finally sold the land to a younger Danish family who had come over from Jutland the year before, a husband and wife with two small boys who reminded Sylva of the nephews she had helped raise decades ago in another country. She showed the new family how to operate the smokehouse. She showed them the damper handle and the flue and the place where the firewood was stacked. She walked them through the chamber and pointed out the place where the mortar needed repointing every 5 years, and the spot on the floor where the fire brick had cracked and been replaced. She gave them Luther's ledger with its 2 winters of temperature records in the back because she thought the numbers should stay with the wall. She moved into a small house in the settlement village, a 2-room cottage with a wood stove and a south-facing window that caught the winter sun. She lived there for 9 years. She grew a small garden in the summers and kept 2 cats that slept on the windowsill, and she wrote letters to the families she had taught and to Hazel in Minnesota and to a few others who had written after the newspaper article and had become over the years something like friends she would never meet. She died in the spring of 1903 at the age of 74 of a quiet pneumonia. The bed where she spent her final days was, by her own arrangement, set against the warm interior wall of the cottage's wood stove, the wall that her landlady kept fed with small, steady fires through Sylva's last illness. Even at the end, she positioned herself next to the warmest stone in the room. Some habits go deeper than memory. In those final weeks, Ardith Jessup came to visit every afternoon. Ardith was old now, too. Her husband dead for several years, her hair white, her hands thin. She would sit beside Sylva's bed in a straight-back chair, and the 2 women would drink tea and say very little because they had understood each other for 30 years and had never needed many words for it. On one of those last afternoons, Ardith asked, "Do you ever regret it staying?" Sylva was quiet for a long time. The light through the south window was the pale gold of early spring, the same light that had fallen across her cabin yard on the October afternoon when the arch held and she sat in the dirt and cried. "I regret that Luther never saw the wall," she said. "The rest no." Ardith nodded. She understood that kind of answer. It was the kind of answer that a woman gives when she has measured her life the way she measured everything else carefully against what mattered, and found that the sum was enough. The original cabin and smokehouse on Sylva's claim were still standing when she died. They would stand for another 44 years, occupied through 3 successive owners, each of whom used the smokehouse wall exactly as Sylva had designed it. In 1947, a lightning strike caught the roof during a dry summer storm and burned the timber structure to its stone foundations. The fire department that came from town could not save the cabin, but they did not need to save the walls. The stone walls survived the fire the way stone walls survive everything, by being too heavy and too patient and too old to care about flame. The shared wall in particular was nearly untouched. 24 inches of fieldstone and lime mortar laid by a woman's hands in the autumn of 1872 stood in the open air after the fire exactly as it had stood inside the cabin for 75 years. A local historical society in the 1960s identified it correctly as an unusual example of integrated smokehouse construction. They set a small bronze plaque into the surviving stonework. The plaque is still there, but the deeper legacy was never in any one building. Dozens of similar structures spread across the upper Midwest through word of mouth and family connection, almost never credited to any single inventor, until central heating arrived and they were quietly forgotten. Engineers a century later would give what Sylva built a name: cogeneration. She would have called it common sense. Her grandmother would have called it obvious. What is remembered where anything is remembered at all is the principle. Heat is not free. Wood is not infinite. If you are burning a fire for one purpose, ask yourself what else that fire could be doing. If you have a stone wall, ask yourself how much warmth it could hold if you charged it slowly and steadily over the course of a day. If you live in a country where the wind comes down off a great lake in January and tries to kill you, do not fight that wind with the brute force of a roaring stove. Build slowly, build thickly, build with the patience of someone who understands that warmth, like grief, like love, like all the deep things accumulates best when it is given time. Sylva Wainwright never said any of those things out loud. She would have considered them sentimental, and she did not have much patience for sentiment. She was a practical woman raised by practical women who measured success in the weight of a cured ham and the depth of a night's sleep in January. She did not build her wall to prove a point or to make a name or to change the way people thought about heat. She built it because she was cold and alone and had two hands and a memory of her grandmother's kitchen and a drawing on a sheet of brown paper, and because giving up was not something the women in her family did. But the wall she left behind said everything she never said. It said it in stone and brick, in lime mortar, on a quarter section of Wisconsin Prairie, south of a small settlement that no longer exists on any modern map, for anyone who happened to pass by and was willing to put their hand against the warm stone and ask the right questions. And in the end, that turned out to be most of her neighbors.